Okay, hello everybody. I'm very lucky to have with me on this Zoom afternoon Professor Michael Rosen, one of the creators of the MA in Children's Literature at Goldsmiths College and a teacher on the course since its inception 6 years ago. Now, many of you know Michael was brought down by COVID-19 way back in March this year and had a very dramatic stay in hospital, followed by so-called long COVID, which he's now battling. We're therefore extremely fortunate that Michael has agreed to be interviewed for the MA in Children's Literature, talking about a key text for the Theory and Criticism module. Welcome, Michael.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Julia.
Hello. As you know, for the session, The Child Reader, we ask students to re-engage or reread with one of their favourite children's books and reflect on some questions. In fact, you designed the questions, so you're well acquainted with them. So is it okay if I ask you the same questions back?
Far away.
Which would you say is one of your favourite children's books?
It's Emil and the Detectives by the writer Erich Kastner. So he's German, so Erich is spelled E-R-I-C-H, and Kastner is K-A-umlaut S-T-N-E-R. In German, I believe it's Emil und die Detektive. And that's the book. Came out in Germany just before 1930, 1928, I believe, and came out in Britain, came out in English here in America just 2 or 3 years later.
Well, that's a coincidence because it's our key text for the week. I wonder how that happened. Why was this book important to you?
So this is a question. So behind each one of these questions, there's a whole theory. So in one sense, that's a very simple question to answer. You just say it was important to me because I loved it, or because I identified with the hero, or because I wanted to be that person. And that's true in this case, and I'll come back to that. But really, this is actually a question about what we call in literature affect. In other words, what was it about that book that affected you? In other words, you put you, the reader, into the book. So what are the feelings that that book and you in tandem engendered that makes you value that book, that makes you, in your cases, students, that you've picked it out of all the books that you've read and said, oh, for me, it's this one. And what makes me do that? And so then I have to engage with the affect of the book and then to go beyond that and say, well, why? So just a little tiny background. I lived in the northwest London suburb of Pinner on the Metropolitan line, which meant that if I went to London, you had to get on a train, not a bus, and go all the way into Baker Street. And the train actually, in those days, resembled a little bit the carriages that you see in the drawings in Emil and the Detectives, little compartments with a door, and people sat very side by side on what were 2 benches opposing each other, opposite each other. Sorry, I'll show you there like that. So you had 2 benches and they're opposite each other and a door one side. And if we went up to London as a family, or when I got brave and a bit older, my brother took me, say, when I was about 9 and 10, we did used to travel about when we were quite young. My brother was 4 years older than me. And quite often these journeys were full of excitement or even a bit of trepidation. Might we get lost? Might we get off at the wrong station? Well, this book taps into those childlike feelings and anxieties about journeys, about getting things wrong, about maybe a stranger who's unpleasant or a bit funny, but you daren't laugh in case you seen as being rude, things like that. So that's part of the affect of the book for me, in that I overlap with it with a very similar experience. So when you say important, that's one of the ways in which I can tap into it, if you like.
I just muted myself because it's pouring with rain and I thought it might get a bit noisy.
Yes.
So, yeah, why was this book important to you?
No,
I guess that's, sorry, you've asked that. How did you and the book get to meet?
Right, so this was straightforward in one respect. when I was in what we used to call third year juniors, which is now year 5,
Yeah.
Our teacher, Miss Goodall, I can remember her very well, read it to us. So this is a very social reading. Never, I'd say students never dismiss or diminish the social situation of your reading. It may be that it's under the covers on your own. It may be with your brother or sister. It may be because your grandmother read it to you. Don't lose that. That's all part of how a book comes to mean. In other words, how it comes to mean something important to you. So I can go along all my old books and virtually say of each one, oh, well, that one is because my brother read it to me, or that one, but so on. So in the case of Emil, this is the social situation of a 1950s classroom, very big because we were all born in 1946 and 45, I think, 45, 46, 47. Anyway, we were all born at that end of the war, which was called the bulge, because there was a huge increase in the birth rate. So classrooms were packed. And if you shared a book, as happened to us at primary school, it was a very social event. And if you were read it chapter by chapter, the book was in a sense interpreted away from the classroom. So this is very important. Where does a book get interpreted? Now, sometimes it's very, very private and totally solitary, of course, but quite often books have an importance because of the way they get shared with your friends or relations, cousins, whoever it is, or a parent. And in this case, with Emil, the way it came to matter was because of the way me and my best friend talked about it. So we chewed over it and talked about it. And we did it with several books. I can remember doing it with the Winnie the Pooh books and together walking down the road singing "My Nose is Cold, Tiddly Pom." So this is very important, and it's often left out of what we call literature, as if somehow or other this literature and reading and the social situation of reading it are two separate things. They're not. That's the sort of, if you like, the tyranny of literary criticism. It's all right, I will concede being guilty of sometimes marking students' essays and imposing this tyranny of literary criticism and leaving behind what we come to call the autobiography of the subject, the autobiography of the question, the autobiography of you. So the autobiography of Emil and the Detectives is me and my friend Brian Harrison talking about the idea that will they catch the thief? Will they catch the person who's nicked the money out of Emil's pocket? It mattered to us so much that we had to talk about it, and we didn't know till next week. And this was, of course, the great trick that Dickens thought he had invented, maybe he did, by serializing his books in magazines that came out once a fortnight. And so people didn't know what would happen to Dickens's heroes for a fortnight. And so there was a fortnight of chatting, saying, I think this will happen, I think that'll happen. And after all, isn't that what we do with soaps? It's the same thing. So in a way, a classroom reading is like a soap, and that was the virtue of it. So the book isn't a soap, but our reading of it was.
Interesting. And I bet there were some other children in that classroom who it didn't have such significance for and who weren't talking about it with their mates on the way home. That's also interesting, isn't it? That it grabbed you and Brian's imaginations. I wonder whether it's partly to do with the German author. Do you think maybe you felt some kind of link because of your background? Sorry, a random question.
Yeah. No, that's all right. My parents, who weren't of German origin, even though I've got a German name, their origins lie mostly in Poland, so it's a bit further east. And I think almost certainly, without remembering the occasion, my parents would have loudly affirmed the fact we were reading that book at school. My parents were fantastic lovers of international literature.
Yes.
So when I look at my shelf of books from childhood, they're full of books from all over the world. And my mum, who was a primary school teacher, made a special effort to find books that were from all over the world. One of my favorite books were a set of French titles in the series called Erich Kastner, which still exist. There was a book called Mosquito Boy about what we would now call the indigenous peoples of Central America. So I had stories that my mates perhaps didn't share. I had a lot of folk tales and fairy tales from all over the world, from France, from Poland, from Germany, from Russia. So I had a sense that literature was a world thing from quite a young age.
Yes, and that's something that I think in the UK we're not very good at, is embracing European literature, whereas the Europeans are much better at it, aren't they? So the next question is, how would you describe the milieu of your reading? Have we dealt with that already?
Not totally. So it's a northwest London suburb in the 50s. So what kind of place was that? So the northwest, and this is part of the sociology of reading. So this is a time straight after the war that I think was in its own way very anxious. This was a time when people had lived through the 1930s and all the privations of the 1930s, the slumps, the unemployment, and the war and the Blitz, and many men, mostly men, not entirely so, going abroad, many coming back injured, and of course people being killed. A sense that Europe, or the world as we knew it, had been laid waste. And there was hope in the 50s, but also an anxiety that I sensed that, for example, at school, there was a huge pressure about how many people would pass the 11 plus exam. And it was like almost every assembly, it felt like, and every maths lesson was, yes, will you pass? Will you
I not? Remember that.
And so this level of anxiety, culturally speaking, I mean, it would be customary, and it's often described this way, we were monocultural. But I think that conceals a lot. We weren't monocultural. There were people there from a variety of backgrounds that were sort of concealed, if you like. So there were occasionally people of Chinese background in our schools. There were people quite often with Irish background that would be concealed. And of course, there was this, talked about it at other times, a kind of concealed contempt, if not direct racism, about Irish people and people of Irish background. And so people used to conceal the fact that their father or mother or both were Irish. And there was bullying around that in that area. So that was a way in which it wasn't quite as monocultural as people want to say. And then in my own case, at primary school, I think probably there were 1 or 2 Jewish kids. There were very few at that time in Pinner. And 1 or 2 kids who had one parent who came from the Indian subcontinent. So in actual fact, to describe it as monocultural, I would just say is lazy. I mean, I think I've done it myself, so I'm not condemning anybody else. And just said, oh, well, we were just a bunch of white kids, suburban kids. And then class-wise, it wasn't that. There were kids at my school at first glance, because we all wore uniforms and a tremendous emphasis on uniform at the school, that the classness was, if you like, obscured, because there was no marking out that I belong to this group because I've got an Adidas trainers and all that stuff that goes on. So classness and sects weren't identified particularly. But looking back on it, I know that there were people who came from council houses. We lived in rented accommodation. Both my parents were teachers. Some people came from quite plush houses. So there was quite a cross-section of the milieu that this book was being read to. So it's quite interesting, you may find, students, to unpick that social milieu and look, just as Julia nicely put it, maybe there were people who weren't doing what me and my mate Brian Harrison were doing, which was, his dad was a builder, by the way, and talking about the book. Maybe other people, it just completely, ran off them like water off a duck's back. It just had no impact whatsoever. And I can imagine quite a few girls maybe not identifying with Emil very much. It is a very boysy book in the sense that it's quite often expressed that this is about boys, and the character of Pony Hootian in the book is kind of fetishized in an odd way. It's sort of not really very satisfactory. So yeah, of course I can't see that, the way in which my interpretation of it is excluding others in the group.
Interesting. Yes, I think I wasn't read it at school, but I think I read it as a child, and I think my family also had that kind of Europhile side to them, so I probably would have been more receptive to it than other children. And also I can really relate to what you're saying about actually the background. The school that I was at was not entirely monocultural, and until this moment I've always thought it was, and actually everything you said in your school existed in mine as well. So I think it's just yes, that we didn't recognize these things. Okay, so that's the Amelia. How would you describe what happened to your reading of the book?
Now, because this book grabbed me, as I said at the beginning, by its affect and the way I related it to train journeys and to the sort of mild anxiety that runs through the book, which is very cleverly created, a sort of sense that he's anxious about the money, he's anxious about, obviously once it gets nicked, he's anxious about whether he'll ever catch the man who has nicked it, and so on. So anxiety. And as a child, I don't think I was an anxious child, but I think I sort of used to speculate a lot about anxiety. I know it's a bit odd, but I used to think, do animals get anxious? Do animals get worried by things? So I did used to sort of think about that. But the way it's intersected with my life is an interest in Germany. So Germany sits, as we all know, geographically in the middle of Europe, and it looks westwards to France and America, and it looks eastwards to Poland, Eastern Europe and Russia. And its Germanic and German culture has had an immense impact on the rest of the world, whether through music, literature, art. And in Britain, we're ambivalent about it. I mean, some for very understandable reasons, because of 2 world wars, but also some of it going back to the 19th century because of industrial rivalry. So there's a kind of idea that somehow or other the Germans are pulling a fast one over the Brits because they've created what are called Hochschule, Technische Hochschule, technical high schools. So it's not fair. Instead of being brilliant amateurs like we Brits, and we just happen to invent some way of blast furnaces, the Germans, they cheat because they study it. So there's a real sense that somehow or other these two rivals, and so there's a kind of anti-German thing that then would then feed in very neatly into the 2 wars. Again, understandably, you know, these were 2 horrific wars. Of course, we might debate at some length, and you know better than me, Juliet, you can explain why. But of course, plenty of people objected to the First World War, and some people objected to the Second World War as well, for a variety of reasons. We won't go into that. But the point is, I've always been very interested in German culture and the way in which, particularly German literature, German art, and what it has to tell us. And so Emil, in a way, links in with it. I've also got another autobiographical reason, was that my father was stationed in Berlin at the end of the Second World War. He was in the American Army, he was born American, and he often talked about Berlin, yeah, as if it was this extraordinary, terrifying, end of the world place at that moment, because it had been bombed to bits in the so-called liberation of Berlin, 1945. And so he was walking around the ruins of Berlin in 1945, and he often described this. And then in 1957, we visited Berlin. So I saw Berlin then, and on the eastern side, East Berlin, and much of it was still in ruins. So Unter den Linden, which used to be this beautiful boulevard, was in fact just flattened. It was just still flat. And so again, that fed into my imagination in a rather grotesque way that interests kids. We once went on a guided tour, and we were told that we were going near Hitler's bunker. And my brother took pictures of it, I remember, and there was a sort of great chunk of concrete sticking out of the ground. And so there was a sort of mythic quality about that in a rather horrific, slightly ghoulish sort of a way. Yeah,
so would you have read Emil before you went to Berlin, or after?
Yeah. So
before.
That's 57. I'd have read Emil 2 years before.
But
then,
you had this background kind of familiarity with the place because of what the stories your father had told, which is another hook, really, isn't it, into the book? Yeah.
Absolutely. And as I say, through life, and then I've often spoken about Emil and the Detectives in a variety of ways, but the most exciting way, and you can find this, dear students, should you be interested, there's a podcast on the Guardian website of me going round Berlin in the footsteps of Emil and the Detectives. So all the places in the book exist in real life. Sometimes he's changed the name, sometimes he hasn't. And I went with the Guardian Berlin journalist, Kate Connolly. So if you Google Michael Rosen, Guardian, Berlin, Emil and the Detectives, or Kate Connolly, added into all that, you'll find the podcast. And we go around Berlin, and there is an incredible moment. I mean, totally not planned or whatever, and I'll spoil it for you for just anyway, is that in the book, which if you haven't read it, you won't know, Emil is heading for his grandmother and auntie's flat, which is at 15 Schumannstrasse. Okay, so Kate and I, we went to look for Schumannstrasse, and it does exist. So we said, well, I wonder if 15 Schumannstrasse, or 15, as you would say in German, exists, and it does. So we looked at this, and suddenly a woman came out, and Kate speaks German. I don't really, I just pretend. And Kate said, it's 15 Schumannstrasse. This is the flat of Emil the Detective's grandmother. And the woman says, yes, I know. I think she says, ich weiß. That means I know, how many people have come to this door. It's as famous. Emil and the Detectives is like, sort of one of the most famous books there are in Germany. So the idea that we had discovered 15 Schumannstrasse all by ourselves is, of course, just a typical sort of egocentric fantasy. But anyway, the poor woman, she was very, very nice, but she said, ich weiß. Anyway, you hear all that on the tape, but we see the stations that are in the book. We see the cafe and the hotel. And for me, in its own silly way, because it is very naive, because it is what's in the book, but not because it's the writer's fantasy. I played with, for example, Thomas Hardy's novels, where you sit there and go, oh, I'm in Dorchester. Oh, that's Melchester in Return of the Native or something, or Budmouth. Oh, that's Weymouth. I played the same game. Anyway, it's good fun in its own.
I'll look it up and I'll stick it on the Learn.Gold session for this.
Yeah.
For this, yes, that would be lovely. So, have you reread the book as an adult?
Oh, only about 30 times. Yes, I have. And it's very interesting to read as an adult, because one of the things it does when you read a book from your childhood as an adult is it allows you to revisit that moment of childhood. You experience the affect. So it may not happen for everybody, but if you allow it to, it's a way of being autobiographical. It's a way of, we all reminisce about our parents, about teachers or whatever. But if you read a book from your childhood as an adult, you can sometimes access the feelings, the anxieties, hopes, desires, whatever, from your childhood through the book. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece of, some might call it a transaction, a kind of exchange with the meanings you were making then and the meanings you make now. So that for start off with, there's that, so I can access my feelings about those compartments that we traveled on when I was a kid. But also with a much more kind of literary critic kind of hat on, the book is incredibly subtle in its form of narration, because there isn't just one form of narration, there are at least two, possibly three. So you have the story, but then you have, and I suppose the word we might use is cameos or vignettes, where the author appears to be talking to us directly on separate pages, as if, well, look, I tell you what, I'll explain what's going on now. And it's strangely intimate. I mean, Roald Dahl has the same idea, say, at the beginning of The Witches or other books of Roald Dahl's, where he suddenly has the liberty of just talking to the reader. I mean, the whole of Danny, the Champion of the World, you could argue, is a bit like that, but obviously he's got a first-person narration. but with the witches, he kind of interrupts it with himself, as I remember. So with Emil, suddenly this person is talking to you who you have to take at face value is Kastner. So that's, in a sense, a kind of false narrator, or a second kind of narrator, the other narrator being the one telling the story. But then there's a sort of wry joke that there's somebody working in a newspaper later on in the book who, if I remember rightly, is called Mr. Kastner. Or there's an indication that it's...
He appears in his own book, yes.
He appears in his own book, so it's a Hitchcock moment.
Yeah.
So there's...
But I think it's interesting what you're saying about how it takes you back. And I'm, you know, one of the things in this session, as you remember, because you set it up, was that the students read a book from their childhood. So I'm sure many of them will have had that feeling of revisiting a time as well as a book and a moment in their life. The last question is one that I know you're very fond of, and it's and you often ask students to do this about an academic text as well, which is, I think, a really good technique. So the question is, what questions would you like to ask about the book?
So you can look at that in a variety of ways. You can do it, what question would you like to ask the author? What question would you like to ask any of the characters in the book? And then what question would you like to ask the book itself? So you can take your pick of which of those, and it can illuminate things for you in a variety of ways. So of Kastner, I would like to ask him more clearly as to why this person whose main job was writing songs for the German cabaret, as we see in the movie Cabaret, he was writing the words for those songs in the old German cabaret before the Nazis came. So I'd like to know, well, apparently one of the stories is that he met a literary agent at a party who said, you know, you'd be able to write a good children's book. And then he went away and wrote it. I mean, but that's kind of an answer, but not an answer. I'd want to know.
Who was that literary agent, eh?
Yes, I think people have her name. Just off the top of my mind. I think
quite a random thing to say to someone.
Yes, indeed. But maybe they saw something. Now, as far as I remember rightly, no, I won't finish that sentence. You know, all sorts of things get us writing children's books, but I'd like to go beyond the fact that because this woman asked me to, I'd like to know, well, what was it that you, as this person famous for writing pacifist cabaret songs, switched to writing a children's book? And indeed a children's book, Mr. Kastner, Herr Kastner, that has become one of the most popular books ever written in Germany. So that's the first question I'd want to ask Kastner, sort of about how he came to write the book. This idea of traveling from a village into a city, which is represented in the book, is a very powerful idea. At least I feel it's quite a powerful idea, because throughout the whole history of Europe, this idea of the village, the city, is a very strong motif. It's there in German folk tales, the Till Eulenspiegel stories. He travels. He's just a country bumpkin, but he's able to trick the people in the town and the cities. So there's an idea, because of the kind of class difference between the burghers, the bourgeois class, the artisan class, the townspeople and the country people, are seen often as just simple people, that the rural folktale often gets its own back through storytelling, and in a way there's a little bit of that in the story. So I'd want to ask him about that as well. And then people in the story, I suppose one of the big questions is about, in the book, Emil is guilty. So he's committed a transgression. He paints the Archduke, I think it is, his face on the statue. So he climbs up on the statue and paints it red. And then that's the reason, it's a very powerful reason, why he doesn't go to the police, right? Because he thinks that he's done this crime. So I want to ask Emil more about this crime, because it seems to be a wonderful pivot in the book. If you've got a criminal in the book, who is a real criminal, he's nicked the money, you've got a boy, but why doesn't he go to the police? Is the question asked of every Enid Blyton, Charlie Higson, Anthony Horowitz's book, you know, well, why don't you just pop down the road and go to the police, or tell your dad or mum or dad or auntie or uncle or whatever, because, you know, they'll go to the police for you. Instead, of course, we have child heroes, and Emil is the classic child hero who doesn't go to the police. But
in the book, there's actually the perfect reason why he doesn't, which most books don't have.
Exactly. And so I want to ask him about this great transgression, because symbolically, it's much more than just a transgression, a naughty boy. He's painting the face of a statue of an old aristocrat. And you've got to bear in mind the politics behind children's books. Quite often it's hidden and not explicit. But the idea that he's desecrating, if anyone who goes to, well, we have it here, you know, these look at, I think it's Lord Curzon at the end of the Haymarket. There's a thing as big as Nelson's column almost, and stuck up the top is some aristocrat. And it's like the old order is represented by these statues. And the old order, you know, in 1920s Germany was very much these old Prussian and German principality dukes, and had other strange names like Landgraves, Landgraf, and things like that. And so it's a symbolic desecration of the old aristocratic class.
And of course, we've had a huge thing about statues recently, haven't we, all over the world? Trying to shift the old order out, and who knows what next.
The way the book alludes to that, and it almost, without doing it explicitly, applauds little Emil for doing so, even though he's haunted by it with a wonderful surrealist dream that Kastner drums up for him as he's asleep on the train.
Yes, so is that it with your questions? You wanted to ask Kastner and the character?
Yes, that's right. And just historically, people might be interested to know, it's just by the by, everyone knows about book burning that happened under the Nazis. Yes, everyone's heard of that. This took place in a place in Berlin called Babelplatz. And you can go to Babelplatz and it's commemorated in the most beautiful way. And hats off to the Berliners for having created this. I won't spoil it, but if you want to look it up, it is stunning what they did. Well, you'll never guess what, but Kastner's works were burnt in that fire that you've seen in documentaries of the Nazis. You even, if they have the soundtrack up, you can hear his name pronounced in a very kind of militaristic way. You hear someone say, Kastner, in a very sort of disgusted tone of voice. Who was in the crowd when they were doing it but Kastner himself? He witnessed the burning of his own books. And apparently, I think it said, either an SS or a Gestapo officer saw him and said, that's Kastner. And then he took to his feet and ran. They never touched him. He lived in Germany all through the Nazi period. He published further books, usually through Switzerland, through Basel, including a little book of my favorite German folk tales, which I've just described, Till Eulenspiegel, a lovely edition. And he lived on. And when he was asked after the war, why did you stay? Marlene Dietrich left, Bertolt Brecht left, Hans Heisler left, all these great German actors, Billy and film directors and so on, Billy Wilder, Erich von Stroheim, I think. Anyway, huge, great raft of them just left. And of course, famously, from a children's literature point of view, The Family of Judith Kerr. Great German film just about to come out. Please see it, everybody, of When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. Just about to come out. I've reviewed it in the next edition of Jewish Renaissance, a book, a magazine. You know, I've lost track. We know about.
So they asked Kastner why he didn't leave. And
why didn't you leave? And he said, because I'm German. So it's quite enigmatic and powerful in its own way. Why should I leave my own country just because this barbaric bunch of people? Now, other people fled because obviously they feared that they would lose their lives. Obviously, in the case of Kerr, it was a mixture that he was radical and Jewish. In the case of Brecht and Marlene Dietrich and some of the others, Hans Heisler, precisely because they were radical, and maybe they'd have been arrested in the first arrest in 1933 and put in Dachau. So, you know, but he was never arrested. Some people were, I think, unkind to him about that, and other people accepted that he was entitled to stay. So there's a nice, interesting controversy. Anyway,
gosh, Michael, how much you've got out of Emil and the Detectives is extraordinary. And that feeds on really nicely from this session we had last week, where we were looking at Peter Hunt's introduction to children's literature, that article, chapter where he says that people say, why are you studying children's books? How can you see all that in a children's book? And I asked the students to sort of write a defense of, you know, what you can see in a children's book. And I think what you've brought out there is incredibly rich to show that there's so much if you go out in all directions from a children's book. That's fantastic. And of course, just want to tell the students that Michael's son is called Emil. So your son has a lot to thank Mrs. Golds, what was her name? The teacher.
Oh, Miss Goodall.
Miss Goodall.
Yeah,
He's an
Emil with an E, and he's,
right,
strictly speaking, named after Emil Zola, Mort Zola. So he's d'après Zola rather than Emil, as you say in German. But anyway, yes, it's in the same sort of family of languages. Yes, family of names.
Okay, I didn't realise that. Okay, well, thank you so much. That's been absolutely fascinating, and it's a real treat for the students to have access to your thoughts about Emil and the Detectives to enrich their reading for the week. All right, thanks a lot. Cheers then. Bye.
All the best.